The desert night in Tempe, Arizona, should have been unremarkable. But on August 12th, 2000, the air refused to cool. Even after the sun dropped below the horizon, the heat still radiated from the sidewalks, shimmering like ghosts rising from the pavement. At 9:38 p.m., security cameras at Fry's Food Supermarket captured a young woman stepping into the glow of the sodium lights. Melissa Turner, just 29 years old, carried a paper bag of groceries and the weight of another long day at the office. She was tired, but she was safe, or so it seemed. Minutes later, her silver Toyota Corolla was discovered abandoned on the shoulder of a highway just 5 miles away. The car doors were locked. The keys remained in the ignition. Her wallet and cell phone sat on the passenger seat, untouched. In the back, bread and milk waited to be placed in her refrigerator. Melissa herself was gone, erased as though the desert had swallowed her whole. Imagine if this happened in your own neighborhood. A daughter who called her mother every single night, vanishing between the glow of a supermarket and the emptiness of a roadside shoulder. No note. No witness. No explanation. Would you believe she simply walked away? Or would every nerve in your body scream that something darker had taken hold? For investigators, the desert offered silence, no answers. The case would grow cold, left in storage boxes and filing cabinets, while her family lit candles and begged for the truth. And yet, 2 decades later, science, the very technology that later breathed life into forgotten cold case files, would speak for Melissa in ways she could no longer speak for herself. This is her story. Stay with us, subscribe, and join a community where cold cases may sleep, but they never die. The image of Melissa walking through those sliding glass doors at Fry's Food would become the last living snapshot of her existence. She had left work around 7:55 p.m. Colleagues later recalled, carrying audit papers and joking with a coworker about finishing them at home. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or escape. Instead, it was routine. Melissa was a creature of habit, and routine was her anchor. She drove less than 15 minutes from her office to the Fry's on Apache Boulevard, parked in her usual corner spot, and went inside under the supermarket's fluorescent lights. Security cameras caught her pushing a cart, picking up a few simple items. A carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and fruit for breakfast. She wore a light denim jacket despite the heat, her office shirt neatly tucked, her sneakers worn but clean. In every frame, Melissa appeared ordinary, tired, maybe, but steady. By 9:38 p.m., she paid at the register and exited through the wide glass doors. A security guard stationed nearby noticed her only briefly, a petite woman cutting across the brightly lit parking lot. He turned his eyes away, distracted by a delivery truck. And just like that, Melissa slipped into the night. Her family expected a phone call that never came. Melissa called her mother every single evening, without fail. Sometimes it was only a few minutes, an update about work, a reminder she had watered the balcony plants, or a promise to meet for lunch that weekend. That night, the line stayed silent. Hours ticked by, and Linda Turner felt the absence like a weight pressing on her chest. She told herself Melissa must have been exhausted, fallen asleep early. Still, she checked the phone again and again, willing it to ring. At dawn, a long-haul truck driver traveling south toward Tucson spotted something unusual on the highway shoulder, just a few miles from the Fry's supermarket. A silver 1998 Toyota Corolla sat alone, its hazard lights off, no signs of damage or a flat tire. Curious, he slowed. The car looked perfectly functional, yet abandoned. Out of caution, he pulled closer and noticed the keys still hanging in the ignition. Through the window, a paper grocery bag rested upright on the back seat, milk sweating in the heat, bread starting to wilt. On the passenger seat lay a leather wallet and a clunky early model cell phone. But no driver, no passenger. He immediately contacted Highway Patrol, reporting what looked like an abandoned vehicle. Police arrived quickly, marking the scene with yellow tape as though the sand itself could erase the evidence. When they opened the door, every detail was wrong. The car was locked, but the keys were still there. There was no sign of forced entry. The groceries remained untouched. The wallet held cash and credit cards. The cell phone battery still carried a charge. If Melissa had walked away willingly, why leave behind everything she depended on? And here is where you, the viewer, must place yourself at that roadside shoulder. If you opened that car door and saw her wallet, phone, and untouched groceries, what would you think? Would you tell yourself she had gone for a walk into the desert night? Or would a chill crawl down your spine, whispering that something unnatural had intervened? Investigators quickly pieced together what little they had. The car's gas tank was nearly full, ruling out a breakdown. No skid marks indicated sudden braking. No signs of a struggle appeared around the vehicle, no torn fabric, no blood, no scattered belongings. It was as though Melissa had simply stepped out and evaporated into the desert air. But those who knew her best insisted otherwise. Melissa Turner was not impulsive. Friends described her as responsible, the type to plan meals a week ahead, to double-check her receipts, to water her balcony plants at the same hour every morning. She had no debts, no history of mental illness, no troubled relationships that might drive her to vanish. Her brother later told police she wouldn't even leave her apartment without locking the door twice. And she never left her phone anywhere. Never. 8. That contradiction, the ordinary woman who vanished in an extraordinary way, haunted the early investigation. Lieutenant Daniel Morales, a seasoned detective with years of experience in missing persons cases, was assigned as lead. From the moment he saw the Corolla, he sensed foul play. Inside the car, investigators dusted for prints. Some belonged to Melissa, as expected. Others were partial smudges, inconclusive. The only item raising further suspicion was a faint, reddish stain on the driver's seat, barely larger than a dime. Was it blood? Coffee? Something else? The sample was carefully sealed for testing, but in the year 2000, laboratories could only do so much. Without clear genetic markers, it was just another question without an answer. The single most striking piece of evidence, however, was not inside the car but within Melissa herself, the habits she carried, the patterns she lived by. Psychologists often remind us that victims leave behind behavioral signatures, and Melissa's signature was consistency. She called her mother nightly, arrived at work on time, balanced her checkbook meticulously, and rarely strayed from routine. To abandon her car, her wallet, and her phone without alerting anyone was not only unusual, it was unthinkable. Neighbors later recalled how Melissa sometimes looked over her shoulder walking down the hall of her apartment building, as though aware of being observed. One elderly neighbor remembered her pausing, listening for footsteps behind her. At the time, these behaviors seemed trivial, the nerves of a young woman living alone. In hindsight, they suggested a creeping awareness. Perhaps Melissa sensed she was being followed long before that night. The desert search began almost immediately. Patrol cars scoured the highway stretch. K-9 units circled the Corolla, noses pressed to the sand, but the scent trails evaporated quickly under the heat. Helicopters hovered above, scanning with infrared cameras for unusual heat signatures among the scrub and rocky washes. Volunteers lined up in grids, moving inch by inch across the terrain. The August sun beat down mercilessly, climbing above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, exhausting even the most determined searchers. Still, nothing. No footprints, No discarded items. No body. The absence was its own kind of evidence. For Morales, it suggested planning. Whoever took Melissa acted quickly and carefully, leaving no trace, no struggle. The Corolla had been locked, positioned neatly on the shoulder as if parked intentionally. It was unlikely Melissa had done this herself. More likely, someone else had driven it, staged it, then vanished into the night. By evening, the Turner family sat together in disbelief. Melissa's mother clutched the phone, still hoping it would ring. Her father scribbled notes on a pad, listing every detail he could remember: Melissa's scar on her wrist, her favorite denim jacket, her sneakers with the worn soles. Her brother pressed officers for updates, his frustration rising with each "we're still looking." The family's home felt frozen, coffee cups untouched on the table, television muted, every sound magnified by the weight of absence. News spread quickly across Tempe. Local stations reported the abandoned Corolla, flashing Melissa's smiling photo across screens. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, wondering if it was a robbery, a runaway, or something worse. For the Turner family, there was no doubt. Melissa had been taken. As the first day of searching closed, Morales stood over a large map in the command tent. He marked in red the known timeline. 7:55 p.m. Melissa leaves work. 9:38 p.m. She's seen at Fry's Food. By 10:00 p.m. Her Corolla sits abandoned. Just over 2 hours, an ordinary evening collapsing into a nightmare. He circled the gap in thick ink. That gap was where the truth lived, and where, for now, Melissa Turner remained hidden. The night crept in again, carrying silence over the desert. Searchlights cut across the scrub, dogs barked faintly, radios buzzed with static. But the desert answered nothing. Melissa Turner had vanished, and all that remained was an empty car, a mother's unanswered phone, and a community staring into the dark, waiting for a sign. The first 48 hours in any missing persons case are critical. Investigators know this window is where hope lives, or dies. For Melissa Turner, Tempe police threw every available resource into those first 2 days. Patrol cars scoured the highways and side streets. Flyers with Melissa's smiling face were printed in batches of hundreds, plastered on utility poles and gas stations. Detectives knocked on doors across her apartment complex, asking neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. The search effort quickly grew into a massive operation. By dawn, K-9 units were brought in, dogs sniffing the desert air as they padded across sand and brush. Helicopters circled above, infrared cameras scanning the dark terrain for any lingering heat signature. Volunteers, students, co-workers, strangers moved by the news, lined up shoulder to shoulder, combing fields and riverbanks. The Salt River, sluggish and shallow that summer, was searched along 5 miles, officers poking at the mud with long poles, hoping for some sign, some trace. But the desert yielded nothing. No discarded clothing. No footprints leading away from the Corolla. No blood. Just silence. For Lieutenant Daniel Morales, the lack of evidence screamed of something deliberate. He gathered his team in a temporary command tent, a map spread across the folding table. Red circles marked Melissa's last known movements. He tapped the board with his pen. She leaves work at 7:55. Fry's Food at 9:38. Then by 10 o'clock, her car is sitting on the highway shoulder. In less than 2 hours, she goes from safe to gone. This is planned. Someone was watching. 8. That theory found its first support when a call came into the tip line. A truck driver, hauling cargo that night, reported something unusual. Around 10:00 p.m., As he passed the area near where the Corolla would be found, he noticed a dark green Ford F-150 pulled close to the shoulder. Its headlights were on. He couldn't stop, he was on schedule, but the image stuck in his mind. When news of Melissa's disappearance spread the next morning, the memory returned with force. A Ford F-150, dark green, parked exactly where Melissa's car would later be discovered. Detectives circled the report in red. Morales knew it could be nothing, or everything. The F-150 was one of the most common trucks in Arizona at the time. Thousands roamed Maricopa County alone. But if this sighting was tied to Melissa's case, it could mean someone had pulled alongside her Corolla, possibly forcing her out, then driven away into the desert. Forensics tried to support the claim. Photographs of faint tire impressions near the car were analyzed, but the desert soil was unforgiving. Wind and heat distorted the patterns, leaving only vague grooves. Still, one technician suggested they looked consistent with the tread of a late 1990s Ford pickup. Nothing definitive, but enough to keep the lead alive. Detectives canvassed local DMV records for owners of green Ford F-150s, creating a list that stretched into the hundreds. Interviews began, but each knock on a door, each question, seemed to lead nowhere. Most owners had airtight alibis, at work, with family, out of town. Each negative narrowed the pool but drained morale. Meanwhile, technicians focused on the Corolla. They collected fingerprints from the door handles and steering wheel. Most belonged to Melissa, but several partials didn't match her prints. In 2000, however, databases were still limited. Many suspects simply weren't in the system. The partials were logged, coded, and placed in evidence, but without a match, they were useless. The small reddish stain on the driver's seat was sent for testing. Weeks later, results came back inconclusive. The sample was too degraded to confirm if it was blood. A single dark hair found on the seatbelt, darker than Melissa's own light brown, was also analyzed. Technicians determined it was human, but the fragment lacked a root. No root meant no full DNA profile. At best, they could note color and structure. Nothing that pointed to a name. For Morales, this was the most painful wall of all. The limits of the era's science. DNA testing was still in its adolescence. CODIS, the national database, contained only a fraction of what it would decades later. Extracting profiles from small or degraded samples was almost impossible. Morales pressed the lab again and again, asking if anything could be salvaged. Each time, the answer was the same. Not yet. Not with what we have. He paced the hallways at the station, the case file under his arm, feeling the seconds slip into minutes, then days. He knew the longer Melissa remained missing, the less chance she had of being found alive. The Turner family clung to hope, but fear seeped into every word. Linda Turner arrived at the station daily, asking if there was news, if the car had yielded answers, if the dogs had picked up a scent. Her husband kept scribbling notes on yellow pads, convinced he might catch something the police had missed. Her brother slammed his fist against the table, demanding why, with helicopters and detectives and dogs, his sister could still be gone. For the community, the case was already becoming legend. Newspapers ran headlines, "Tempe woman vanishes without a trace." Coffee shops buzzed with speculation. Some whispered she had left voluntarily, running from a secret life. Others argued no, it was an abduction, a predator waiting in the parking lot. See, Morales hated those conversations, knowing how rumors corroded investigations. Yet he could do little to stop them. At the end of each day, he returned to the board. Red circles, timelines, notes. 8, 0P, M, leaves work. 9, 38. Supermarket camera. 10. U0. Car abandoned. Witness sees F-150. He underlined the gap, again and again. That missing time was a void he couldn't fill. Weeks stretched into months. Leads dried up. The truck driver's account remained unconfirmed. No one else had seen Melissa after she left the supermarket. No camera captured her outside that parking lot. The desert, vast and merciless, had swallowed everything. For Morales, the hardest moment came when the case was reclassified. The urgency faded. Other crimes demanded manpower. Melissa's file was stamped with a phrase he hated. Possible abduction, no body. The energy drained from the room. The board was cleared. The pins were pulled. Melissa's name slipped into Arizona's growing archive of cold case files. That phrase would later appear in reports and articles, a cold description for a living family's nightmare. For Linda Turner, it meant fewer phone calls, fewer updates, fewer people searching. For Morales, it meant guilt. He felt as though he was abandoning her, though he never stopped replaying the case in his mind. Still, he made one quiet promise.
To the family, and to himself. Preserve every piece of evidence, every stain, every hair, every fingerprint. One day, science would advance. One day, the case could rise again. And to you watching this now, the echo of that promise is why stories like Melissa Turner's still matter.
They are not just history, they are warnings, lessons, reminders that justice doesn't always move fast, but it must never be forgotten. If stories like this matter to you, hit like, because keeping cold case files alive is the only way justice returns. By the third week of Melissa Turner's disappearance, the case had become more than an investigation. It had become a storm. Tempe police still sifted through tire marks and fingerprints, still combed through DMV records for the elusive green Ford F-150. But for the Turner family, time no longer moved by hours or days. It stretched into unbearable waiting, each night marked by silence where Melissa's voice should have been. Linda Turner, Melissa's mother, had spent years answering the same nightly call. Sometimes Melissa's updates were brief. I'm home safe. Other nights, they stretched longer, discussions about work, family recipes, or the flowers she had planted on her apartment balcony. That habit was her heartbeat, the rhythm of her days. And now, with each ringless night, Linda felt the world collapse inward. You must imagine it for yourself. If you were her mother, would you ever stop calling her phone? Even when voicemail picked up, even when the same recorded message played again and again, you'd press redial, as though persistence could drag her back. Linda did exactly that, her hands trembling on the receiver, her eyes burning from sleeplessness, whispering, "Pick up, honey, please pick up." 8. When weeks passed without answers, the family reluctantly stepped into the harsh glare of the media. A Phoenix news station invited Linda for an interview. She sat under studio lights, her face gaunt from grief, her eyes swollen from crying. Holding Melissa's photo, she spoke directly into the camera. "Please help us find our daughter. Melissa would never leave without telling us. She would never abandon her family. If you know anything at all, please come forward." Her voice cracked, but she did not falter. The plea aired statewide, replayed on every local channel. Viewers across Arizona saw a mother's desperation etched into every syllable. Many wept. Some called the hotline with possible leads, though most proved false. For a brief moment, public sympathy surged. Neighbors brought casseroles, churches organized prayer groups, and volunteers returned to help with searches. But sympathy had a dark shadow. Tabloid outlets, hungry for headlines, began spinning their own narratives. One paper printed, "Did Melissa run away with a lover?" Another, "Financial trouble behind disappearance." Both stories were groundless, concocted from scraps of rumor. Melissa had no debts, no hidden romantic turmoil. Yet these headlines hit the Turner family like daggers. Strangers in grocery stores whispered. Anonymous callers left cruel messages. She probably left because she wanted to. Linda, already drowning in grief, now faced suspicion layered atop loss. Morales despised the tabloids. He told a press conference bluntly, "There is no evidence Melissa left voluntarily. This is a criminal investigation." But his words barely pierced the noise. In the age before social media moderation, rumors spread unchecked, carving wounds that the family could not heal. The Turners fought back the only way they could, by holding vigils. On a warm evening in Tempe's Central Square, the family gathered with friends, co-workers, and sympathetic strangers. Each carried a white candle. Together, they lit the flames, small pinpricks of light flickering against the desert night. Photographs of Melissa were displayed on easels, her smiling face at 29, her green eyes bright. A local pastor led prayers, voices trembling as they asked for her safe return. For Linda, the vigil was both agony and solace. The sight of dozens of candles reminded her how much support remained, how many cared. Yet each flame also marked absence. Melissa was not there to see them burn. Reporters filmed the event, broadcasting images across Arizona. For those watching, the vigil cut through speculation. They saw not gossip, but grief, not scandal, but love. Candles were more than grief. They were a demand. Don't let her vanish into cold case files. Those words echoed across headlines the next day, capturing what the vigil symbolized. The flames were not resignation. They were protest. Protest against indifference, against time, against the machinery that threatened to bury Melissa's memory. Still, grief gnawed at the family in private. At home, the Turners preserved Melissa's room exactly as she left it. Her books lined the shelf. A sweater draped over the chair. Her sneakers sat by the door, waiting to be worn again. Emily, Melissa's younger sister, once admitted she opened the closet at night just to breathe in the faint scent of her perfume. "It makes me feel like she might walk back in," she whispered to her parents. Morales visited the family often. He could offer little beyond reassurance. "We're still working. We haven't given up." He saw the toll with each visit. Linda grew thinner, her hair grayer. Her husband sat silent, staring at the floor, scribbling notes that no longer mattered. Emily drifted through the house like a shadow. Each time Morales left, he carried their anguish with him, fueling his determination. Yet he knew determination without evidence was a fragile weapon. Meanwhile, the hotline continued to ring with tips. A woman swore she saw Melissa in Tucson, working at a diner. Another caller claimed she spotted her in Flagstaff. Each lead required time and manpower to verify, but everyone ended the same: a dead end. The more false leads arrived, the more drained the investigation became. Community support wavered. New stories filled the evening news: fires, politics, other crimes. Melissa's case, once front page, slipped further back. For the family, this slow fade was unbearable. "It feels like the world is forgetting her," Linda told Morales. "She's my daughter. I can't let her be forgotten." 8. To counter the fading attention, the family organized more vigils. Each August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they gathered again in Central Square. Attendance dwindled as years passed, but the flames never failed. A cluster of candles glowing against the night sky, voices singing prayers, photos taped to lampposts. For those present, the ritual was sacred. For the Turners, it was survival. Through it all, Linda kept calling Melissa's phone. Even after months. Even after the line was disconnected. She saved the old voicemail greeting, replaying it just to hear her daughter's voice. Neighbors could hear the muffled sobs at night. For them, it was haunting. For her, it was the only thread left to cling to. If you were her mother, would you ever stop calling? The human mind craves answers, but for the Turners, only questions filled the silence. Where was Melissa? Who had taken her? Why had the desert revealed nothing? And most painfully, was she suffering in some forgotten corner, or already gone? These questions invaded their dreams, their meals, their conversations. Grief was no longer an intruder. It was a permanent resident. The media, sensing fading interest, sometimes reignited coverage. Each time, the Turners braced themselves. Sometimes stories were compassionate, reminding the public of Melissa's kindness, her devotion to family. Other times, tabloids resurfaced cruel theories. The family had no shield but each other. As months turned into a year, hope hardened into a kind of desperate endurance. The Turners vowed never to stop. They made posters, handed out flyers, begged officials to keep the file active. Morales promised to preserve every scrap of evidence. But without breakthroughs, the case teetered on the edge of silence. For the family, silence was worse than death. Death meant mourning. Silence meant limbo. And that is why, decades later, the memory of Melissa Turner still lingers, not just in the evidence, not just in the police files, but in the love of a family who refused to let her vanish. Comment below if you'd stand with families like the Turners, waiting years for justice. By February 2001, nearly 6 months after Melissa Turner vanished, Lieutenant Daniel Morales sat in his office with a pen hovering over a form he dreaded. The investigation had hit a wall, no fresh leads, no usable DNA results, no witnesses beyond the fleeting memory of a truck driver who had spotted a green Ford F-150 near the Corolla that night. He stared at the words printed on the form. Preliminary report, case to be moved to cold case. With a sigh, Morales signed. That single signature was like lowering a coffin lid. The Turner family received the news with disbelief. Linda wept openly at the station, repeating, "She's not a file, she's my daughter." Emily, still only a teenager, cried so hard she could barely breathe. For them, the words cold case felt like abandonment, as though the police had given up hope. Morales assured them this wasn't the end. "We'll reopen the file with any new information," he promised. Yet, even as he spoke, he knew how thin those words sounded. The file was shelved among hundreds of others in the Tempe archives. A thick folder labeled Possible Abduction, No Body. And just like that, Melissa Turner's name joined Arizona's long list of the missing. The newsroom cameras no longer lingered on her face. Headlines shifted to other tragedies. Her photo, once splashed across every TV screen, slowly disappeared from the airwaves. At home, the Turners refused to surrender. Linda printed missing posters herself, plastering them on lampposts and bus stops in Phoenix and Tempe. Her husband carried stacks of flyers in the trunk of his car, handing them to anyone who would listen. Each August, they organized vigils, holding candles, praying into the desert night. But as the years rolled on, attendance dwindled. Morales carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. He could not shake the image of the silver Corolla abandoned on the highway shoulder, the grocery bag untouched in the back seat. Whenever he passed the evidence locker, he would stop by Melissa's file. He would run his fingers across the sealed envelope containing the single strand of hair, darker than Melissa's own, collected from the driver's seatbelt. In 2000, technology hadn't been strong enough to pull a full genetic profile. He knew science was advancing, but how long would it take? Would Melissa's family still be alive to see justice if answers came decades later? Sometimes, late at night, Morales opened the file in his office. He spread the photographs across his desk, the faint stain on the seat, the tread mark near the Corolla, the security camera still of Melissa pushing her grocery cart. He stared at them as if sheer willpower could force them to speak. And maybe you've wondered this yourself. If it were your sister, could you ever stop searching, even decades later? For detectives like Morales, those cold case files weren't just folders, they were unfinished promises. The early 2000s passed, then the mid-2000s. New detectives joined the force, young and eager, but many barely knew Melissa's name. For them, the file was just one of many. For Morales, it was the case that haunted his career. In 2004, he sent the seat stain for additional chemical testing, only to be told it was too degraded for results. In 2006, he asked a tire expert to re-examine the tread marks near the Corolla. The response came back the same. Likely a Ford F-150, but not definitive. Every test ended the same way, with the bitter taste of almost, but not enough. The Turner family never stopped reminding the public. Each year, Linda wrote letters to the police chief, enclosing Melissa's photo and a handwritten note. Don't let her disappear a second time, in people's memories. Some chiefs wrote polite replies. Others didn't respond at all. In the mid-2000s, Melissa's name resurfaced in a new arena. The internet. Online crime forums like Web Sleuths began discussing her case. True crime enthusiasts reshared old newspaper articles, uploaded the Fry's food security camera still, and speculated on theories. Some suggested Melissa had been stalked by a stranger. Others thought she might have known her abductor. A user claiming to be her former college classmate described her as quiet and responsible, the least likely person to vanish willingly. The forums brought comfort to the Turners, knowing strangers still cared. But comfort could cut both ways. Some posters floated cruel or absurd theories. Melissa had run off to Mexico, or joined a cult. Emily, now in her 20s, admitted that reading those threads sometimes left her in tears. They don't know her. They don't know who she was, she told her mother. Morales himself browsed web sleuths on late nights. He never posted, but he read. Sometimes he scribbled notes, even though most claims were wild speculation. Every now and then, a comment struck him. A detail about the parking lot, a suggestion to re-examine soil near Maricopa. He felt a strange kinship with these strangers online. They, too, refused to let Melissa vanish completely. Still, the years dragged on. By 2010, it had been a decade since Melissa disappeared. Morales had transferred to other units, solved other crimes. Yet Melissa's file remained his shadow. He kept a photo of her in his desk drawer, a silent reminder. When colleagues asked why, he simply said, "Some promises you can't put away." 8. At home, Linda and her husband aged visibly. The vigils grew smaller. Sometimes only 10 people stood with them, candles trembling in the Arizona night wind. Yet Linda lit hers every year, whispering the same prayer. "We'll bring you home, Melissa." By the late 2000s, technology had advanced. DNA testing could now extract profiles from smaller samples. Morales tried again, resubmitting the hair fragment to the state lab. Weeks later, the answer came back. No match in CODIS. Whoever had left that hair had no criminal record. Another door slammed shut. The silence weighed heavier with each year. Reporters no longer called. Neighbors stopped asking. For many in Tempe, Melissa Turner was a name faintly remembered, a face glimpsed on an old poster. But for the family, the loss never dulled. At night, Linda still replayed Melissa's old voicemail greeting just to hear her daughter's voice. Morales, now approaching retirement, sometimes drove out to the stretch of highway where the Corolla was found. He would park on the shoulder, step out, and let the desert wind whip against his face. He imagined Melissa walking that parking lot, the glow of sodium lights on her denim jacket, the sudden vanishing behind rows of cars. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We're not done." Eights. But in truth, the case had fallen into the long silence. A silence where evidence waits, families ache, and detectives grow old staring at files that refuse to close. And so, for 16 years, Melissa Turner remained a mystery. Her family clung to hope, her mother lit candles, and Morales guarded the evidence like sacred relics. The city moved on, but in one suburban home and in one detective's heart, the silence never meant surrender. It only meant waiting for the day science, or fate, would finally speak. In the summer of 2016, 16 years after Melissa Turner's disappearance, the desert finally gave up its secret. On a scorching June morning, a construction crew working on the expansion of State Route 347 near Maricopa began their shift as usual. The bulldozers roared, steel teeth scraping against hardened earth. At 8:15 a.m., one worker, Hector Rodriguez, lowered his shovel and froze. Mixed in with red soil were fragments that looked eerily white. At first, he thought they were animal bones, common in Arizona's rugged land. But when the next scoop revealed a partial skull, intact teeth glinting in the sunlight, his stomach dropped. The site manager immediately called 911. Within the hour, police and forensic teams arrived, sealing off the area with yellow tape. The ground shimmered with heat, but investigators moved carefully, brushing sand away from shallowly buried remains. Bit by bit, a human skeleton emerged. Alongside the bones lay scraps of tattered fabric, a frayed denim jacket, and rusted jewelry, a silver heart-shaped necklace, corroded but still recognizable. For those who remembered the case, the sight was like a ghost returning. Melissa Turner had vanished wearing a light denim jacket, her favorite sneakers, and that heart necklace engraved with her initials. And now, here they were, buried just 5 miles from where her Toyota Corolla had been abandoned in 2000. The discovery hit retired Lieutenant Morales like a thunderclap. Now, in his 60s, he was consulting with the cold case unit when the call came in. Driving out to the excavation site, he saw the police tape fluttering in the desert wind and felt every year of his old guilt pressing down on him. 16 years of wondering. 16 years of standing over Melissa's silent file, waiting for science to catch up. He walked slowly to the pit, the skull half unearthed, the denim fabric flapping in the hot breeze. Whispering to no one but himself, he said, "We finally brought her home." Eights. The excavation stretched across 2 days. Technicians used soft brushes and fine instruments, numbering each bone and bagging them with precision. The skeleton was remarkably intact, suggesting it had been buried quickly and undisturbed. Several ribs bore fractures, and a faint dent marked the skull, early signs pointing toward blunt force trauma. Still, only a full forensic exam would determine the cause of death. The necklace was the most haunting artifact. Investigators noted the faint etching inside the silver heart. MT. The Turner family had described it in 2000 as Melissa's cherished piece of jewelry. Now, corroded but unbroken, it seemed to testify silently across time. When the call reached the Turner home, Linda collapsed at the kitchen table, Her husband caught her as she shook, clutching a framed photo of Melissa wearing that very necklace on her 25th birthday. For 16 years, hope had been both a torment and a lifeline. Now, the discovery of bones meant hope was over. Melissa had never left Arizona. She had been here all along, beneath the sand. The remains were transported to the Pima County Medical Examiner's office in Tucson. Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Karen Whitfield, examined the skull and immediately compared dental records from Melissa's old x-rays. Each molar, each crown lined up perfectly. Still, Whitfield wanted irrefutable proof. She extracted mitochondrial DNA from a femur, comparing it with the sample from Linda Turner, preserved in the case file for 16 years. The results came back days later. 99.9% match. When Morales received the printout, he stood motionless for a long time. The weight of 2 decades pressed into that single sheet of paper. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. After all the years of silence, after vigils and false leads, there was finally an answer. Not the answer anyone wanted, but an answer all the same. The Turners were summoned to the station for the official confirmation. When the officer read the words aloud, "DNA confirms the remains belong to Melissa Turner," the room froze. Linda buried her face in her hands, sobs racking her chest. Emily clutched her mother tightly, whispering, "We found her. We finally found her." Melissa's father sat still, his face pale, gripping the table edge as though to hold the world steady. For the family, the discovery was both closure and new grief. Closure because the limbo had ended, grief because knowing meant accepting death. As one grief counselor later put it, the cruelest thing about cold cases is that families grieve twice, once when the person disappears, and once when they're finally found. 8. A week later, Melissa's funeral was held for the second time. This time, not as a vigil, not as a prayer for safe return, but as a final farewell. Hundreds gathered in a suburban Phoenix cemetery. Friends, co-workers, old neighbors, even volunteers from the 2000 search came to pay respects. The coffin was adorned with white flowers. Inside were Melissa's remains, along with the rusted silver necklace and tattered denim jacket, objects that had traveled with her into the earth and back. Candles flickered as attendees lined the walkway, their faces lit by both flame and tears. Linda stood before the coffin, her voice trembling but steady. "We waited 16 years to bring her home. Now she's finally at rest." Her words rippled across the crowd, many weeping openly. News outlets across Arizona covered the funeral extensively. The Arizona Republic's front page declared, "Melissa Turner is finally found." Television stations replayed the candlelit scenes alongside archival footage from 2000, Melissa leaving Fry's Food Supermarket, clutching her grocery bag. The contrast was unbearable. A young woman on the cusp of her life, and now a coffin lowered into the earth. The public response was overwhelming. Online forums reignited with threads dissecting every new detail. Some users wrote messages of comfort. "She's finally with her family. But who did this to her?" Others pointed out the haunting proximity. Melissa had been buried just miles from where her car was left. The desert had concealed her for 16 years, within sight of where search teams had once scoured. For Morales, the discovery was both a vindication and a heavier burden. Vindication because his instincts were right. Melissa had been abducted and killed, not vanished voluntarily. Burden because now it was not only a disappearance, but a homicide. He looked at the forensic report noting rib fractures and skull trauma and whispered, "We knew. We always knew it wasn't an accident." 8. The Turner family now faced the cruel paradox of closure. They could finally lay Melissa to rest, no longer wondering if she was alive, yet the certainty brought fresh pain. Emily described it later. For years, I dreamed she might walk through the door. Finding her ended that dream forever. Closure doesn't mean the grief stops. It just means you know where it comes from. 8. For Linda, the second funeral was both relief and torment. Relief because she could stop searching highways with binoculars, stop calling the disconnected number, stop clinging to rumors. Torment because now she knew Melissa had been killed, her life violently taken. As she pressed her hand against the coffin, she whispered, "At least you're not alone anymore. At least we brought you home." 8. The wider community reacted with a mix of shock and renewed anger. 16 years of searching had ended not with a miracle, but with bones unearthed by chance. For many Arizonans, it was a reminder of how fragile safety can be. A woman could disappear on an ordinary grocery run, and the desert itself could hide the truth for nearly 2 decades. For true crime investigators, the case shifted gears. No longer a missing person, it was now a confirmed homicide. Evidence from the gravesite, metal fragments, soil samples, even the placement of the body would become crucial. Morales knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The desert had answered one question: where Melissa had gone. But it left another screaming louder than ever. Who had put her there? Still, for one moment, the Turners found themselves able to breathe. For the first time in 16 years, they had a place to visit, a grave to touch, a plaque bearing Melissa's name. Linda said quietly, "Now we can sit with her, instead of waiting for her." 8. It was not the ending they wanted. It was not justice. But it was something. Share this video, because the more people know, the less chance any victim stays hidden in cold case files. By 2019, 3 years after Melissa Turner's remains were discovered, the case had moved into an entirely new era. What had once been limited by the blunt instruments of early DNA testing was now empowered by technology that could pull entire genetic blueprints from a single degraded sample. Morales, though retired, still consulted with Tempe's cold case unit. When the younger detectives suggested sending Melissa's jacket fibers to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, Morales felt the pulse of hope he hadn't dared touch in years. The denim jacket, found buried beside Melissa's remains, had preserved tiny biological traces, fragments of sweat, skin cells, and microscopic hair strands. In 2000, these would have been useless. In 2019, they were a goldmine. Parabon Nanolabs specialized in forensic genealogy, using DNA to build genetic family trees by comparing unknown profiles to the millions of genetic data points shared publicly through consumer ancestry services. Weeks later, the results came back. On a glowing monitor in a Tempe conference room, analysts revealed a sprawling family tree. Branches fanned outward, dozens of names connected by bloodlines, distant cousins and great-grandparents mapped by invisible strands of DNA. But through the branching web, one surname repeated with unmistakable frequency: Harris. The DNA pointed firmly to a family in Tucson, Arizona. Morales leaned forward, tapping the screen. "This is it," he whispered. For nearly 2 decades, he had stared at unanswered questions. Now, the data provided a direction. Investigators narrowed their search within the Harris lineage. Several men were alive and living in Arizona, but one stood out immediately. James Harris, now 52, had lived in Tempe in 2000, less than 3 miles from Fry's Food, where Melissa was last seen. DMV records revealed he had owned a 1997 dark green Ford F-150, registered between 1996 and 2001. The same make, model, and color described by the truck driver who had passed Melissa's abandoned Corolla. The pieces clicked together with chilling precision. A man who lived nearby, who had the vehicle that haunted the case, and whose DNA ran through the very fabric of Melissa's jacket. Morales gripped the edge of the table, whispering to himself, "After all these years, OAS, but genetic genealogy only pointed to a family. It wasn't courtroom proof. For that, investigators needed direct DNA from James Harris himself. And so, surveillance began. Younger detectives tailed Harris through Tucson. Outwardly, he lived an ordinary life. He worked at a utility company, commuted daily, and spent evenings with his wife and children in their modest home. To neighbors, he was the helpful man who lent tools and walked his dog. To police, he was the ghost of a 20-year-old crime. For a week, they simply observed, careful not to raise suspicion. Harris had routines. Every morning at 7. Year 0, he left home in a silver pickup. By 8. Year 0, he stopped at the same coffee shop, ordering a large black coffee. He smoked during lunch breaks, flicking his cigarette butts to the pavement before crushing them underfoot. To a detective's eye, these habits were more than routine. They were opportunities. The break came on a warm June morning. Harris left his coffee cup in a public trash can before driving off. Within seconds, a plainclothes officer retrieved it, sealed it in an evidence bag, and rushed it to the lab. Days later, another team collected discarded cigarette butts outside Harris's workplace, each carefully bagged and logged. Morales, though no longer leading the unit, sat in the lab with the team as the results came in. The air was tense, every officer leaning forward, breaths shallow. When the analyst finally looked up from the computer, her words fell like a verdict. It's a perfect match. James Harris's DNA matches the DNA recovered from Melissa Turner's jacket. 8. The room fell silent. Morales closed his eyes, exhaling 20 years of burden in one long breath. For 2 decades, Melissa's case had been a scar on his conscience, a wound that technology could not close. Now, forensic genealogy had done what his generation could not. Forensic genealogy, the tool rewriting cold case files across America, finally pointed to Harris. 8. The evidence was undeniable. The jacket preserved his biological trace. His discarded cup and cigarette butts confirmed the match beyond doubt. The man who had seemed invisible for so long was finally cornered by science. For Morales, it was a bittersweet triumph. Relief because the truth was finally in hand. Anger because Harris had lived freely for 2 decades, blending into suburban normalcy, while Melissa lay in a shallow desert grave. He thought time would protect him, Morales said later. But time is no longer on the side of killers. 8. The Turners were informed that the DNA had led to a suspect. Linda wept, repeating, "We waited 20 years for this." Emily, her voice shaking, added, "It's not over yet, but we finally have his name." For a family that had lived on whispers and vigils, the confirmation was like opening a locked door, terrifying, but at last, clear. As preparations began for an arrest, the investigators felt the weight of justice finally shifting. Decades of silence had been broken by strands of DNA no thicker than dust, preserved on a jacket buried in the desert. For all the years Harris believed himself untouchable, his downfall was sealed by a sip of coffee and a cigarette flicked to the ground. Science had spoken, and Melissa Turner had her voice back. Subscribe now, because every breakthrough proves science is the voice of the voiceless. On a sweltering June morning in 2020, Tucson woke quietly, but for the Tempe Cold Case Task Force, the day had arrived. After 2 decades of shadows, they finally had James Harris's name on an arrest warrant signed by a Maricopa County judge. At 5:30 a.m., the silence of a suburban neighborhood broke as armored vehicles rolled into the cul-de-sac. SWAT officers in black vests moved swiftly, surrounding a modest one-story home with manicured lawns and white fences. A loudspeaker shattered the dawn. "James Harris, this is the police. Come out with your hands raised." Eights. Inside, Harris had been in pajamas, sipping his first coffee of the day. He stepped onto the porch, face pale, eyes wide as he registered the rifles, the flashing lights, the command to kneel. Neighbors peered from windows, stunned. Mrs. Marjorie, who lived next door, later told reporters, "He was just the man who helped me carry groceries. I never thought he could be tied to murder." Eights. Harris was cuffed on his driveway as cameras captured the moment. Within hours, the images spread across Arizona. The once anonymous neighbor now exposed as the suspect in a 20-year-old killing. For many, it was a chilling reminder that monsters sometimes mow their lawns beside yours. The evidence against Harris was laid out in bold strokes. The DNA from Melissa's denim jacket matched perfectly with DNA collected from Harris's discarded coffee cup and cigarette butts. DMV records showed he owned a green Ford F-150 at the time of the crime. And his employment history placed him in Tempe in 2000, living within 3 miles of the supermarket where Melissa was last seen. When the indictment came down, prosecutors charged Harris with first-degree murder. Lead prosecutor Karen Whitfield stood before reporters and declared, "This case shows the power of persistence in science. The evidence tells us who ended Melissa Turner's life, and we intend to prove it in court." Eights. The defense struck back quickly. Harris's attorney, Mark Delaney, emphasized that there were no eyewitnesses to the murder, no murder weapon, no video of Harris with Melissa that night. He called the case a patchwork of speculation pinned to a single thread of DNA. More importantly, he aimed his attacks at the method of discovery: forensic genealogy. Delaney argued that using genealogy databases to trace relatives without direct consent violated privacy rights. "If this is allowed, no American's DNA is safe," he told reporters, planting seeds of doubt before the trial even began. For the Turner family, the months leading to trial were an emotional blur. Linda, Melissa's mother, still clutched her daughter's photo each day. Emily, now grown, steeled herself to testify about the ripple of grief that had defined her life since she was 17. At night, Linda admitted she often stared at Harris's mugshot online, whispering, "You took her from us, but you won't take her memory." Eights. When the trial opened in September 2021, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, cameras clicked outside, and every seat was taken. Harris entered wearing a gray shirt, his hair grayer, but his posture stiff, cold. He showed no emotion as he sat at the defense table, scribbling notes with deliberate calm. Prosecutor Whitfield began with a simple, powerful statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a story about technology alone. It is about a young woman who vanished on a summer night, a family who waited 20 years for answers, and a man who thought time would erase his crime. Science has given Melissa Turner her voice back." Eights. The state presented DNA charts, genealogy maps, DMV records of Harris's F-150, and testimony from Melissa's co-workers who recalled her growing fear of being watched before she disappeared. The jury watched intently as Whitfield pointed to the forensic evidence. "The odds that this DNA belongs to anyone else are 1 in billions." Then came a surprise witness. Victor Ramirez, a gas station attendant who worked near Fry's Food in 2000. For years he had remained silent, but now he testified that on the night of Melissa's disappearance, He saw her speaking briefly with a tall man in a light shirt near the parking lot. When shown photos, he identified Harris as that man. His testimony sent murmurs through the courtroom. Delaney pounced, cross-examining with sharp skepticism. 20 years ago, Mr. Ramirez, are you certain your memory isn't clouded by the countless faces you saw? Isn't it possible you're mistaken? Ramirez held firm, but Delaney's questions underscored the fragility of memory. Still, the DNA was the cornerstone, and it was unshakable. The defense leaned heavily on constitutional arguments, framing genealogy as overreach. Today it's my client, Delaney thundered. Tomorrow it could be any of you, accused because a distant cousin uploaded their DNA online. He pointed to the jury and pressed the theme of liberty, of protecting families from government intrusion. But then, the Turners took the stand. Linda, trembling yet resolute, spoke of the nightly phone calls that stopped abruptly, the vigils that dwindled year after year, and the moment she collapsed when DNA confirmed Melissa's bones had been found. Holding her daughter's photo, she turned toward the jury. We don't want revenge. We want truth. Please don't let her vanish a second time. Eights. Emily followed, her voice steady, describing how she grew up in a house hollowed by absence. She looked at Harris and said, "You stole not just my sister, but my childhood. I want the jury to know. Silence has ruled our lives for 20 years. Don't let his silence speak louder than science." Eights. The courtroom fell silent. Jurors leaned forward, their faces tense, some visibly shaken. And here, the trial sharpened into its central question. If you were on that jury, could you ignore both science and silence? The prosecution closed by reminding jurors that the DNA wasn't abstract. It was Melissa's final witness, carried on her jacket through 2 decades of dust and time. The defense closed with warnings about slippery slopes and government overreach. But as the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke. Outside, the Turners waited hand in hand, knowing that 20 years of agony now rested in the minds of 12 strangers. For the first time since Melissa's disappearance, the weight of justice felt near enough to touch. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the room fell into a silence that felt older than time itself. 12 strangers filed back into their seats, expressions grave, eyes locked on the judge. Harris sat stiffly, hands clasped, his face pale but unreadable. Linda Turner gripped Emily's hands so tightly their knuckles whitened. The 4-person stood and read the words that had been 2 decades in the making. We, the jury, find the defendant, James Harris, guilty of first-degree murder. Eights! Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Linda collapsed against her daughter's shoulder, tears pouring down her face. Emily pressed her forehead to her mother's, whispering, "We did it, Mom. We did it." Even some jurors fought to keep their composure, the weight of 20 years pressing down as the verdict rang out. The judge wasted no time. Harris, convicted of Melissa Turner's murder, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No second chances, no freedom after decades, the same fate Harris had stolen from Melissa, now handed to him. He showed no emotion, his eyes fixed on the floor as deputies cuffed him and led him away. Outside, the crowd of supporters erupted. Reporters shouted questions, candles were lit in broad daylight, and a wave of catharsis swept across the Turner family's friends and neighbors. For 16 years, they had gathered at vigils begging for answers. Now they stood together, crying tears of relief instead of despair. Linda addressed the cameras, clutching Melissa's photo against her chest. We prayed for justice, and we waited for so long. Today, our daughter's voice was finally heard. Her words carried a weight that pierced through television screens across Arizona. Morales, now retired but present at the verdict, stood at the courthouse steps. He spoke softly but firmly. Justice may come late, but it comes, and today, it came from Melissa Turner. His voice trembled for the first time in years. The burden finally lightened. For the community, the verdict was more than a conviction. It was a reminder that no case is ever truly closed as long as someone remembers. Forensic genealogy, persistence, and the voices of families had combined to bring truth from silence. Melissa's story had begun as a disappearance, stretched into a decades-long wound, and now closed with a name, a face, and a sentence that would never be undone. Because every voice, every share, every memory keeps cold case files alive. Eights. That truth is what binds stories like Melissa's together. It wasn't just detectives and labs that solved this case. It was the community that refused to forget, the family that kept lighting candles, the strangers online who discussed her name late into the night. Together, they kept the flame burning until science could ignite it into justice. And now, for you watching this, the story is no longer just Melissa's. It's ours to carry forward. If you believe justice delayed is never justice denied, subscribe and share this story. Together, we'll keep cold case files burning with light.